You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network.
Be cautious. Never assume that everything is okay. This is not a job for predisposed attitudes about people or about the job.
And it's the unknown. I think that adds the stress.
If safety's important to you, it's not going to happen on its own.
How we carry ourselves is the key to our safety and achieving our goals.
Focus is probably the most important part of personal safety.
Our goal should be to help the defendant and to go home safely at the end of the day.
Live from the Federal Judiciary's studios in Washington, D.C., the Federal Judicial Center presents Safety Series, Personal Confrontations.
Hi, and welcome back to the Safety Series. I'm Robin Rowland. Mark Maggio wasn't able to be with us today, so I'm sitting in. This is our 5th broadcast. We set the scene back in 2001 with programs on mindset and officer preparation, which continue to be themes and underlying all the broadcasts. We then looked at some things that officers have experienced, first in the office and then in offenders' homes. Today, we're going to crank up the intensity a bit by looking at a topic that we all hope never to experience, personal confrontations. As usual, the scenes that you'll see today are taken from real life. They're based on hazardous duty incident reports that were filed by your colleagues. We talk with the officers involved, and we do our best to recreate what happened. In addition to 2 dramatizations, we're fortunate this time to be able to bring you an interview with an officer who experienced a major traumatic event. Let me introduce the panel. My colleague Bill Timish will be facilitating the discussion today. Bill is an education specialist here at the FJC, and he's been responsible for developing the Safety Series since its inception. We have 3 panelists in the studio. Bruce Vasquez, Supervising U.S. Probation Officer from the Eastern District of California, Bob Musser, Chief U.S. Probation Officer in the Middle District of Tennessee, and Jeanette Scheel, Chief of Safety and Integrity in the AO's Office of Probation and Pretrial Services. We also have 3 panelists who will participate by phone. Gary Christian, Supervising U.S. Pretrial Services Officer in the Western District of Texas, Isabel Pruneda, Supervising U.S. Probation Officer also in the Western District of Texas, and President of FPPOA, and Ron Scheit, U.S. Probation Officer, District of Nebraska. And we'd like to invite your participation as well. Please fax us your questions and comments at any time during the broadcast to the number that's now appearing on the bottom of your screen. And with that, Bill Timish, it's all yours.
Thank you, Robin. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our panel. As Robin mentioned, our topic today is personal confrontations. We'll be looking at 3 specific incidents and diagnosing those at your sites and at the table. Our way of discussing these will be basically the same for each incident. We're going to start off by showing you a vignette, a tape basically of what happened, and then give you about 5 minutes to talk about it in your districts. After that, we'll take it back here to the table for a longer conversation with the panel and to hear more from you. As far as other material you have with you, please take a look at the material from the participant guide that your facilitator has, and you'll be able to then go through more discussion at a later time. Also, as Robin mentioned, please be sure and send those faxes out. We'd be happy to talk to you more as we go through the program. We're going to be starting with our first vignette, and this one has a nice title that'll make a lot more sense as we get into it. It's titled Family Affair. Let's take a look.
My partner and I figured an early start would give us a better chance of seeing Dmitry Mikhailovich. Mr. Mikhailovich had served 78 months for fraud and conspiracy to commit arson, using fraudulent documents to obtain financing to buy a large factory warehouse complex, and then having it burned down Mr. Mikhailovich was due to terminate supervision in 2 months. Despite making consistent restitution payments, he still owed $3.9 million. I was the third officer to supervise Mr. Mikhailovich, and he was known for verbal aggression. But I didn't expect a problem that day because I was there just to tie up a loose end I had discovered.
Hey, did you see that?
What?
There was somebody at the window, and I couldn't see who.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Mikhailovich.
Good morning.
What's good about the morning it starts with you ringing my doorbell? We are all sleeping.
We apologize for the early hour, but we haven't been able to reach you later in the day.
I've been busy. Come on in.
Good morning, Mrs. Mikhailovich.
Go back to bed. We'll go in here.
How are things going?
Business still sucks. My sons are still slubs. I'm still on federal probation. What's up?
Well, I need to ask you about something I just ran across. We thought you owned your home here, but I did a routine records check, and I found the sale of this residence back in 1998. Purchase price was listed as $600,000.
$600,000? No, not right.
Let's see. Record says December 8th, 1998. Buyer was AJ Enterprises. Does any of this ring a bell?
We never sold the house. We lost it in foreclosure. 600,000. Forget it. It never happened.
This foreclosure is news to me. Do you have any records you could show us?
The house was in my wife's name. Maybe that's why it's new to you. But whatever happened is nothing to do with probation office. Not your business.
I'm afraid it is our business. You see, at the time of your sentencing, you owned this house. If you no longer own it, we need to see some type of documentation of the transfer.
I have not any documentation. It's been...
Whether it was a sale, foreclosure...
5 years. I have not one piece of paper. You want to know about this, you should ask me in 1998.
Mr. Mikhailovich, I'm just trying to clarify some issues. We're getting ready to terminate your supervision. There's no need to get excited.
Why are you asking me all these questions? I tell you again, was my wife's house.
Your conditions require that you provide full financial disclosure. That includes this information. We need...
You show me order from judge.
Mr. Mikhailovich, please.
That I have to show that to you. Now, please, leave my house.
You can check the judgment from the judge or simply look at the conditions of your release.
I tell you again, get out. I show you nothing. It's too much. Get out now. Stevie!
We're going.
You will not go fast enough. Go, now. Now you see. You'll be sorry.
We're leaving now.
Watch this. I go to get my son. You stay here. You'll find yourself in a different place.
What just happened? Talk to me. Is make too much trouble. I get you what you want.
Stevie!
Oh, Stevie is a good boy. He don't want no trouble. He not fight for you no more.
Come quickly, quickly!
Why are you so angry? What is wrong? Stay up there. Don't come down, Stevie.
Mr. Mikhailovich, you need to report to the probation office at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
I report no place. I do nothing. Fuck you. Fuck you. Fuck you.
Mr. Mikhailovich, stay back. We're going now. Don't make this worse. Stay back.
Not so fast, you punk bastard. You come back here and let me teach you a lesson. My son will knock you out with one punch. One punch. You pussy. I'll kick your ass. You see what happens when you mess with Mikhailovich. I kick your ass myself.
Mr. Mikhailovich, if you don't stay back, you're going to make me restrain you.
You think you can hold me back? You think again. My son will knock you. Ah. Fuck you. Fuck you. Fuck all of you bastards. Bastards.
That was just such a quiet neighborhood. Who'd have thought? So issues come up regardless of where you're at. So we're going to give you some time now to reflect and discuss what you just saw. You'll get 5 minutes, and then we'll bring it on back here to the panel where we'll have a longer dialogue and bring in our remotes for some further chat. And take your 5 minutes now. Welcome back. I'm sure you had some good opening discussions on that one. We're going to now turn it to the panel to see what they have to say about this situation. I'd like to start with Bruce on this question and just to ask in general, what do you see as the safety issues in this scenario?
Well, the primary safety issue that got my attention was obviously the threat being made by the offender. My impression was that this was not bluff behavior threat. He was calling his son. The wife made some reference to the fact that the son wasn't going to fight for him anymore. So that would lead me all to believe this may have been a serious threat, and correctly the officers got up and started to move out. I would have liked to seen them move out of the house a little quicker, but it was a very serious threat, obviously. Second safety issue that comes to mind was the comments that the officers made to the fact of possibly restraining the offender. Safety is about options, and I think restraining the offender would probably have not been the option that I would have chosen in this sort of situation, simply because it can be a very dangerous option to try. I would have possibly do something that would have got me out of the area a little bit quicker. But those are the two primary safety issues that came to my mind in watching this scenario.
All right, so we have the offender's behavior and certainly his son, and then we also have the evolving issue of a conflict and how the officer reacts. Isabel, from your side watching this, any other general safety issues that you see?
Well, Bill, I agree with what Bruce has said. The offender, to me, was a major concern. The officers knew that he was known for some verbal aggression, and from the beginning of the contact, there were verbal cues by the offender. You know, he was indignant and angry, and it escalated to becoming hostile and then challenging the officers. So I think that raised a big safety issue.
Thank you. You know, Jeanette, Isabel brought up a pretty good issue about the history of the offender and perhaps some known safety risks. Given the offender's circumstances, would you have raised the financial issue in this setting?
You know, given his particular set of circumstances, I might have chosen to do the interview in the office and potentially had him bring the documentation for the ownership of the house. But, you know, I guess we all know the reality of the situation is that you talk about issues like this in the field, and I think the key here is to really consider, when you're planning the visit, the factors involved. In this case, he's close to termination. He still owes quite a bit of money, and apparently maybe even avoiding the officer, trying to coast to the end. They all do, toward at that point in their supervision. And considering the fact that he's kind of known for verbal aggression, you know, those are factors that we need to think about when doing a confrontation like that. And, you know, maybe an office setting would be a better place for that.
So you have to look at the whole issue and certainly where you might want to have that conversation. Gary, let me ask you, I know in pretrial services certainly you're doing a lot of assessments of assets and investigations. What are the issues here regarding the financial circumstance, and would you have handled this in a home context setting?
Well, unfortunately, sometimes you don't have a lot of choice. As uncomfortable as it may seem sometimes, we've been charged by the court to monitor compliance with conditions. Not only is it necessary, it's a responsibility. I think what's important is to be cognizant of the environment that you're in, your surroundings, at the time when you broach sensitive matters. There are probably other ways of obtaining that information, county records, state records, things of that nature. But sometimes we're called to make those tough calls in tough places. Again, being cognizant of your surroundings and your environment when you broach these sensitive subjects would benefit you.
So basically, it's the reality that you are out in the field. You may have to get the information there to be aware of what you might be walking into. Very good. Bob, I'd like to sort of take this back a little bit to the scenario. We looked at the evolving conflict and the decision point when the officers decided to exit. Would you yourself as an officer have exited at about the same time or earlier, or when would you have ended it?
Well, actually, personally, I would have exited at the first point when he stood up and demanded that I leave his house. I believe at that point you've exhausted any ability to get what you want from him. Simply leave, instruct him to bring whatever documentation you want him to bring, come see you at the office. And had they left at that point, it would have avoided the son coming down the stairs, the wife being involved, and they could have been out before that became an issue. Unfortunately, we get baited into conversations where we want to have the last word. And we got to be cognizant of that and be careful that we don't let someone bait us to staying someplace where it becomes unsafe longer than we should, just because we want to be the ones to end the conversation.
So there might have been a false comfort zone when the wife comes down and they think that she's going to resolve the issue, right?
It created more time for the son to get involved in the issue.
All right. Isabel, how about from your setting where you're at, what do you think you'd do as far as when you terminate this contact?
Well, I echo what Bob said. I would have left at the time that he stood up and said that he asked the officers to leave. I would have left at that time. I think that common sense has to come into play and just have the officer telling the offender to report to the office and just exit at that time. That's when I would have left.
It's a good safety mindset, but certainly we all know things change when you're in that situation, so that definitely is something to consider. Bruce, I'd like to take a look a little bit at the interaction between the officers and the offender. We had two officers in this situation. Do you think if we had just the primary officer alone that there would be any difference in how he interacted with this offender?
My impression was not. This offender appeared to me to be used to being confronted. He had a history of being confronted. And my impression is that he was going to be confronted whether there was one officer there, two officers there, or four officers there. That was just what he did. Again, the impression I get is that his son has probably acted for him as some sort of an enforcement issue or some sort of tool to be brought into this. So I think that how many officers you had there would not have made a big change in how the offender behaved. I think it would have been helpful to have two officers there had this turned into a physical confrontation. It's always safety is in numbers. It would have been nice to have a person there. But my impression was that this offender was going to act that way irrespective of who was around. This was his nature.
So he wasn't intimidated at all by the presence of two officers, obviously?
Not at all. I think the officers' options we talked about before of threatening to restrain him aggravated the situation a little bit more. But as far as how his initial contact was, I don't think it made any difference how many officers were there.
Okay. Ron, I'd like you to maybe turn on your safety hat there. I know you do safety training in your district. And looking at this question in perhaps a little bit different way, is it possible that the presence of another officer might in fact add a different level of comfort and confidence for an officer to get into this situation, that perhaps he's going to stay longer because he has backup?
Bill, I would definitely agree with that. I think, although as Bruce indicated previously that there is safety in numbers, I think oftentimes we have a tendency with a partner officer, it kind of is a false sense of security. I think at times we have a tendency to stay a little longer with a partner officer, maybe get a little more comfortable with a partner officer, and oftentimes possibly enter a situation with a partner officer that we normally wouldn't enter on our own. So I think that although there is definitely an upside in having a partner officer, that there can be a downside as well if we get that false sense of security.
But Ron, I take it that the one thing that remains constant there is a safety mindset, whether you're alone or with your partner.
I would agree. The one thing that I noticed, too, with the partner officers, there didn't appear to be any communication in the form of either verbal or nonverbal communication. When the situation started to escalate, it's almost as if both officers would get to a point and were looking at the other officer to cue them in what to do, and they both kind of froze, and consequently neither did anything. So I think communication is extremely important if you're working with a partner.
Thank you, Ron. Bob, I'd like to, again, kind of turn this a little bit and look at a different aspect of this situation. We know there was the threat by the officer that if he didn't back off, the offender did not back off, he was going to restrain him. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the considerations behind that phrase, or how that might develop potential risk, or what circumstances the officer needs to consider when using that approach.
Well, in the given scenario, once they made the statement, stand back or I'm going to have to restrain you, and the offender stopped, they had a chance to disengage and leave the situation, but they were baited into a conversation. They wanted to finish a conversation with him. Once he stopped walking towards them, they had their chance to disengage and get out. The issues that you have coming along, if you do go to a restraining type move, you now have two more parties that could get involved. Anytime you have a domestic dispute, you have a wife who, although she was helpful to the officers, could turn in a minute. And you have the son who's already aggressive and acting aggressive at his dad's wishes. So we have that. And a lot depends on the type of training the officers have had. Are they talking about empty hand controls? Do they have handcuffs? We know that they have their weapons because as they stopped and turned back around to face him, you could see that. But we don't know if they had handcuffs. We don't know if they had any other kind of capstan or any other kind of instruments for restraining, or if they were going to go to empty hand control. So there's a lot of issues with training, but once they got into that scenario, had they gone to an actual restraining move, you have two other potential offenders getting into the situation, and you've just lost your numbers.
So this is perhaps getting out of control. We don't know who else is in the house either, right?
Right.
All right, let me ask the same question to you, Gary. As far as The officer, obviously in that situation with the mindset and circumstances he's facing, when he says, step back or I'll restrain you, what issues does that bring up regarding the officer's safety or what needs to happen next?
I think what we can't lose sight of is there's still options, even when you make the comment about restraining. Your first option should be to leave and to get out of the environment. So my primary safety concern would involve the agitated state of the defendant or the offender, his family, and the close proximity they were. And now that he's agitated, my having to come into personal physical contact with him to restrain him, it's difficult enough to restrain someone who's cooperative. Having to restrain someone who's uncooperative would be very, very difficult. Not only do you run the risk of hurting him, but you and your partner getting hurt as well. So I would think that regardless of what comment he made about the restraining issue, that your option is also to leave, and we should utilize that option first and foremost.
So a safe exit, basically, and understanding that you need to be carefully trained and ready to follow those kinds of issues, right? Thanks, Gary. For the panel here on this scenario, any further questions or issues that is raised for you that you'd like to cover?
Well, I just like to re-emphasize the difficulty in restraining, even for officers who do restraining often, like police officers. Restraining is a very dangerous option to use unless you've had a lot of practice. And if you've had a lot of practice, it's a very difficult option to accept. So that was just, in my observation, an unnecessary safety issue that these officers raised in this particular scenario.
We're going to move to sort of a different scenario, although this also involves partners, but involves different situation and obviously different characteristics of the offender. This next scenario is entitled Punch Drunk. I think you can figure out why, and we'll roll the tape and take a look.
Frank Miller is a troubled Vietnam veteran whose history includes abuse of alcohol and several drugs, and threats to the president. He was serving a 3-year probation term for cashing stolen checks. For the first 6 months, he had been confined to a halfway house, where I'd seen him weekly. Regular drug and alcohol tests had all been negative. Frank had been released just the day before.
Hey, Frank.
Oh, what do you want?
We're just stopping by to see how you're doing. Must feel good to be out of the halfway house, huh?
I'm doing fine.
Good, good.
It's good to see you fellas. I see you around.
Looks like you're having trouble with that key there, Frank.
New apartment, yeah.
Frank, have you been drinking?
No. I went to the eye doctor. Give me them drops. I can't see a damn thing.
You need me to help you with that, Frank?
No, it's good seeing you guys. I see you around.
You know, I was thinking, Frank, it would be nice to come in and check out your place and maybe refresh our memory about some of your goals now that you're out.
I was going to crash. You know, the eye drops. I'm not feeling too well.
It won't take too long.
Fine. Come on in. Just halfway house, no fucking privacy.
Look, Frank, we know you want to stay in your own place, and we're trying to help you keep it together, but if you start getting into trouble on your first day out, it doesn't look so good.
I ain't getting in no trouble.
Hey there! Hi, Mr. Long. You headed this way?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, how's it going? Looks like you and Frank started to celebrate getting out of the halfway house, huh?
Yeah.
It's all about, we went to see eye doctor together.
I see. So, tell me, who drove, you or him?
He did. I helped.
Really?
2 for the price of 1.
But Frank, you don't have a driver's license.
Sure I do. I got a Kentucky driver's license. I can drive here.
Can I see it?
Yeah, sure, no problem. It's right here somewhere.
Frank, this is not a valid driver's license. This is a Kentucky ID card. And something tells me that you are over the legal limit for DUI.
I'm not drunk. I told you, we went to the fucking eye doctor.
Frank, don't tell me that smell is eye drops. I'm gonna have to ask you to take a breathalyzer right now.
That's fine. I got nothing to hide.
Good. Okay. You ready?
Almost.
You remember how to do this, Frank? Okay, here you go, Frank. Okay. All right, Frank, you see this? It says 0.20.
So I went to Murphy's just to celebrate the holiday. So what? I got my freedom before the 4th, and I was feeling patriotic. And I had 3 beers. You ain't got a problem with that, do you?
Frank, this is more than 3 beers. You're intoxicated. And yes, it's a big problem. The conditions of your release state clearly that there's to be no alcohol whatsoever. And driving in this condition, you could have hurt yourself or somebody else.
See, I can't drive. My knees are all fucked up. He did good. He worked out okay.
Mr. Long, we have to ask you to leave right now, okay? Please.
Fine. I'm gone. No problem. I'll see you later, Frank.
Frank, we're gonna have to take you to detox.
Yeah, sure, whatever you say.
Okay, you ready to go?
Yeah, I knew you were gonna fuck over me. You've been on my case ever since day 1.
Frank, I'm only trying to help you succeed in your probation.
Boy, you got a strange way of showing it. Calling my boss and telling him I can't drive? Fucking a landscaper, not drive. I'll kick your ass.
Frank, you're gonna make things a lot worse making threats to a federal officer.
And telling Maggie to keep my kids away from me. You're not a little kid who thinks he runs the world.
Frank, we're gonna need to go to detox right now.
Fine.
Come on, let's go. Come on.
Frank, you want to lock your door?
You lock the goddamn thing.
Frank, you don't want to leave your door unlocked.
It's already locked, asshole.
All right, come on, let's go.
No, I'm not going in front of you.
Come on.
No, I know you little prick. You push me out of steps and break my neck. I'm just such an asshole for a PO.
Listen, Frank, you're not helping your situation here. You need to calm down.
You little twerp. I'm 55 years old. I kick your ass 6 ways Sunday.
Frank, you need to take it easy. I will talk to you when you're sober, but right now you need to back off.
I'm a fucking...
I said back off.
Let me tell you something, little boy. You done fucked over me one too many times. I'm gonna kick your ass.
Frank, calm down. You're too smart for this.
He's just been after me since day 1.
I don't think so, and this is not the way to fix your problem. You're just hurting yourself, man.
He just pisses me off.
Listen, Frank, the police are coming. If you can manage to calm yourself down before they get here, things will go better for you.
Calm. Just keep that fucking asshole away from me. Kid Lewis is fucking everything up. You fucked me over one too many times, Lois.
Here they come.
Well, again, I guess we see objectives changing on us with these home contacts. We're going to give you a few minutes to discuss this, but first I'd like to emphasize that we'd love to have your questions on these scenarios. There's a fax number that should be appearing on the lower third of your screen. Please fax those in and we'll get to those as soon as we can. At this time, we'd like to give you 5 minutes to discuss and to react to the scenario you just saw. Well, welcome back. I'm sure you had some good discussions, or at least starting some good discussions. We're going to now bring it back to the panel for some observations. I'd like to start with Jeanette. If you could just give us an overview of the safety issues you see in this one.
Clearly, there are several issues here. Most glaring, of course, is the officers are going on a home contact, not knowing what to expect, and they get there, and the offender's a bit intoxicated. And that...
Well, he was released from a halfway house
yeah,
after all.
Yeah,
so.
Why not? But, you know, that in and of itself brings several issues. I mean, the potential for violence to himself, to others, you know, to the officers, which actually came to fruition. Then, you know, they have never been to the residence before. They're walking in the residence, and it's apparent that it appears to be a narrow kitchen leading into the living room where they ended up talking, and the exit route is pretty much blocked at some point, and by this person who comes in, another issue, safety issue to be considered, the third party, he comes in, and not only is he on supervision, but he's also drunk. And now there's a lot of issues that arise from that situation.
So this is complicated and very unsafe. We have an intoxicated offender and his pal, and we have an environment where they're not very much aware, perhaps, of exit routes. Ron, could you help us out and add any other safety issues you see in this scenario?
Well, basically, to just echo what Jeanette said, I think the obvious is you're dealing with a rather large, obviously intoxicated individual who has either real or perceived negative prior experiences in history with the PO. The third party is unexpectedly introduced into the situation, and you're also dealing with some very tight quarters there at the residence. And throughout the contact, the offender becomes increasingly belligerent and starts to escalate.
So they have to think quickly, Ron, and look for distance in that situation?
Without a doubt, yes.
Bob, as far as the issue with the offender and having a conversation with someone who's intoxicated, what would your primary objective be once you make that contact and you see the offender's condition? What is your objective now? What are you going to try and do?
Well, once you realize that someone's intoxicated, obviously intoxicated, there's no point to your contact anymore. Nothing you say is going to be remembered by this individual. Directions that you give aren't going to be followed. He's intoxicated. In this particular instance, the officers may have wanted to just end it right at the door. I think that as it came out later in the scenario, the fact that he had driven home could have been one of the concerns that they had, as he had a whole ring full of keys. And they wanted to find out whether or not he was driving, and in that situation possibly take the keys, let him into the house, call for one of his counselors, since he was in a couple different kinds of counseling, mental health and alcohol counseling, and maybe have one of the counselors come to the scene. Or, as I believe it was Gary pointed out before on a different broadcast, there are police departments that will respond and take someone into detox for them. And maybe just back out of that situation and let somebody else come in and take over at that point.
So you want to safely exit the scene and have some control with that offender so that he doesn't cause any more danger to anyone else.
Right.
Gary, let me ask you, just as a follow-up to this, regarding what you're going to do with someone in this condition. What are your primary responses? And if you could comment on the idea of transportation, which I know is a district-specific practice, but I'd like to have your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Just to kind of echo what Bob said, any kind of conversation with this individual at this point in time with the intoxication level, probably very little benefit. But there probably will be a need to continue conversing with him on some level, only because you can't leave him in the current state that he's in.
And what about the transportation issue? Comment on that.
That indeed is a tricky issue. We here personally in this district don't have a policy as far as transporting. My experience has been, though, transporting a person under these circumstances with this intoxication level would be very, very dangerous. We talked before in the previous scenario about restraining someone who didn't want to be restrained. Trying to get this individual in a vehicle to get him where you need to get him would be very, very difficult. Bob mentioned about police departments. Given this defendant's level of intoxication, contacting the police and having him taken into custody, whereby then you could possibly get him into detox. But I'd not at all advocate putting this individual in a government car under those current circumstances.
Thank you, Gary. And obviously there are very specific issues for those officers to consider and unpredictable behavior on the part of the offender. Bruce, let me talk a little bit more about risks in that situation that you might have seen in addition to our discussion by the officers.
Well, there were a number of risks there. Many of the risks that the officers faced may have been beyond their control. They can't control the environment, the close quarters in which they were interviewing this person. But the couple of risks that I think that were within the officers' control was allowing the third party to come in. Was a risk they took upon themselves, because they could have easily had stopped the third party from even entering the situation. At some point when things started to escalate, they did ask the third party person to leave, but they allowed him, invited him almost to come into the situation. And then once he was in there, he put the contact officer in a dangerous situation. He stood right behind the contact officer. He distracted his cover officer, because the cover officer should have been focusing on the offender, but instead he had mixed observations with a third party who was doing some bizarre activity and movements in the background. So that was a risk I think they could have controlled. Another risk that was within their control was the transportation decision. As Gary and Bob have pointed out, some districts allow transportation of offenders, some districts do not allow it. That's a district by district procedure, but I think any district should have concerns about allowing officers to transport someone who's intoxicated, because they're unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to decide to do while you're driving down the freeway, or where you're going to sit him at, what positions he's going to be in. Those are things that require a lot of training before you just haphazardly put an offender in your car, let alone an intoxicated offender in your car.
Thanks, Bruce. Those are good points. And Jeanette, as far as policy, districts that do choose to have that option as far as securing a safe environment, what are some general issues of policy they should keep in mind regarding those practices?
Well, I think that, before any transportation of a non-government person is conducted in a car during the course of duties, the officers should really be clear on what that policy is in the district. Either do it or don't do it. It's as basic as that, but basically the General Counsel had talked about this, had some discussion about this several months back, and I think it was suggested that a district should have in place some written policy concerning the transportation of non-government employees, and that policy would outline clear details of how and when that should be done, and who should be consulted possibly before somebody's transported. I mean, in this case, maybe the officer should have called the supervisor and say, is this something that we could have done? And it may have been done.
Thank you. And I want to emphasize that, too, with the situation, that we are not particularly aware of all the circumstances behind this, and we would assume the district certainly was following their practice and policy, and we applaud the officers for a safe exit there. Isabel, I have just one more question regarding circumstances here, and that's the third party. Just respond to Bruce's comment regarding that danger, but also if you could respond to the issue of this third party was not a complete stranger to the officers. They greeted this person. They knew this person was out of danger in terms of letting that person stay as long as they did.
I believe that it was. I think that that person, the third party, should have been asked to leave the minute he came in, and that would have kind of taken away a little bit from the risk. But I think they just let him stay too long by the time they asked him to leave.
All right, so they obviously can't take safety for granted here, and they need to control that environment as soon as possible. Thank you, Isabel. Bob, just to look a little bit differently here and talk about partners again, as an officer in this situation, would you have handled this contact differently if you were by yourself?
Oh, certainly. When you're confronted with an intoxicated individual, much less, as Ron pointed out earlier, a very large intoxicated individual, on a one-on-one situation, you've really put yourself at risk if you continue and you go into this house. Another issue that, as far as one-on-one contact, was the ring of keys that he had, which could have been used as a weapon at any point. Simply back off the porch. He invited them twice, 3 times to leave before he ever opened the door, saying, I'll get with you again another day. Great exit line. Yeah, you're right. Maybe we can talk again tomorrow. Come by and see me, and exit yourself from that situation. Sometimes we draw ourselves into situations where we shouldn't because of partners, and I think Ron also pointed that out. That we feel safe with a partner there, and sometimes we allow that to draw us further into a scenario than we should. But when they're that intoxicated by yourself, it's not a good idea to go in.
So despite the nature of officers to be very task-driven, they need to always think about safety as well as they're carrying out their duties, I take it.
Yes.
And Ron, I am going to throw this one back out at you. I guess you're getting the partner theme here today. But again, do you think the partnering issue had any impact on that officer's, the primary officer's decision to continue and have that conversation with that offender?
Oh, I think without a doubt it probably did, Bill. I think once again we oftentimes get that false sense of security with a partner, and we tend to enter or stay or conduct business we normally probably wouldn't as a single officer. I thought it was interesting, too, that as soon as the third party was introduced into the situation, that any initial tactical advantage that the partners enjoyed prior to that was negated as soon as that other individual arrived. So I think that the partner officer probably did allow them or have them stay a little longer than normally they would have. I also think as a single officer, I certainly wouldn't have been giving the breath test just as a result of the close proximity you'd be required to be to the offender to give that test.
So there's time and distance issues with safety, obviously, there, right, Ron? Thank you. I think we've got a fax that's come through. So before we go to our final question, I'd like to have Robin, if you can, please read that fax and we'll respond to it.
We do. We have actually 2 faxes. The first one, and this relates to the partner issue that you've been talking about. At the beginning of the scenario, it was clear who was the primary and secondary officer. Toward the end of the contact, those roles appeared to change. Is this a problem? Should the roles have been maintained by the officers as they were at the outset?
That's a great question. In fact, let's start that one, and Bruce, I'll start with you and get a response on that. There was a change in terms of the contact for that.
That was a very good question, and I noticed that also. For whatever reason, in this particular scenario, it seemed that the offender was really focusing on the primary officer. For some reason, he was under the impression that this primary officer had just ruined his life. And at that particular point, obviously since he even tried to strike him, at that particular point, he was through communicating with that primary officer. There was no more communication. That primary officer became the enemy. And I think that in an excellent way, the secondary officer stepped in and diffused some possible more physical response. And I think that was a great movement by these 2 particular officers, because at that point, the offender stopped listening to the primary officer, so they changed roles, and effectively, the secondary officers diffused a problem that could have been very serious.
So your observation was this was synchronized and effective, and obviously the partners had communication beforehand.
I would think so, and the secondary officer correctly observed that the offender was just going beyond reason when it came to his focus on his probation officer.
Good response. Isabel, what are your thoughts about the change of the roles and who becomes primary and how that worked out in this scenario?
I think in this scenario it worked out really well because, like Bruce said, the offender was focusing on the primary officer, and once the threat was made, the secondary officer took over and was able to kind of de-escalate the situation.
So I guess the results show sort of how that worked out. Robin, you had another fax, if we could look at that one too.
Yes, Bill. This one is from the Western District of Wisconsin. In both scenarios, the approach of officers to the situation escalated events and created more problems for them by throwing violations in offenders' face. Any other suggestions?
Let's see here. I think that should be an easy one to answer. There were issues, obviously, with conflict here, and perhaps the presence or the actions of the officers was a factor. Gary, let me start with you on that question. How do you respond to that?
Well, ideally, you want to address those issues in your office in a safe environment where you're basically in control. But that's not always an option for you. We don't know what went into this. This may be an opportunity, the only opportunity they had to speak with those individuals about those 2 violations. The first one appeared to be planned. The second one they basically kind of walked into, so they had to deal with that. But yes, ideally you'd want to deal with any kind of violations, any kind of adverse action with one of your defendants or your offenders in your office in a safe environment where basically you're in control. But that doesn't always happen. So in the second scenario, you deal with it as it comes. The first one, there may have been a bit more planning, whereas the defendant could have come to the office and those issues could have been addressed.
So it's a matter of where you can diffuse a situation easily. All right. Bob, any comments on your side from this?
Just that as an organization, we tend to become task-oriented. And with the first scenario, the task became getting the answers to the question and getting the documentation about the sale of the house. And the second one, the task seemed to become getting that breathalyzer test and getting the evidence that he had violated his conditions. We just have to remember that there's no evidence out there that's more important than our safety. And if it's an unsafe situation, if it's escalating to the point where it can get unsafe, you simply back out of the situation and you go about getting your evidence in a different way.
Good point, and obviously the focus on safety is important to everyone, so we're going to talk more about that as we move on. I do want to thank you, Robin, for those faxes, and thank the districts for sending in very good questions here. Please keep those coming. And now, Jeanette, just to sort of wrap this one up and turn to a final question, as far as the post-incident issues which we have here, after the officer is safe and after the offender is controlled, what else has to happen? What are the follow-up actions the officer needs to take for the community?
Well, surely after everything's secure and everybody's safe, like you said, that there really has to have some planning has to begin even before that person is released from custody. The file needs to be changed to reflect that there's a clear indication that this person will be intoxicated again, that there's a possibility of violence, and anybody picking up that file should be able to see that this person is a violent offender. And the plan, the objectives, and the strategies should tie right into that whole safety element all along the way. And it's sometimes I think officers tend to not want to supervise somebody like that again, maybe not in this particular extreme, but it's a great opportunity at that point to really start thinking about, let's get them into treatment, let's do this, but also start thinking about the risk factors involved and contacts with the community.
And I hear a little thread of new monograph 109 coming out.
Definitely.
So that's worth study here too, an application. Good. Thank you very much. Gary, any other thoughts regarding follow-up actions that you think the officer needs to take here for community safety?
Well, the first thing that came to mind for me was continue to address the issue with that defendant who's intoxicated. You basically have an obligation to deal with that. The fear would be that you walk away from that situation in that state he was in, he gets in the car, drives away, and then somebody gets hurt, not just him but somebody else. So before the treatment issue, dealing with that situation, if it's, at least the police need to be contacted. This man needs to be taken out of his current environment and get into a place where he can basically sober up. To do nothing in that case would be a very, very serious mistake. So as unpleasant as it may be to deal with that, that's an option. To walk away would not be an option for us.
Good point. And obviously, we also need to deal with that offender's friend. We don't know where he went either. So those are good points regarding the control issues and what has to happen next. Robin, you have another fax for us?
I do. One more fax, and this one also relating to the aftermath. The offender attempted to punch the officer. Do you charge him with assault?
Well, I won't answer that as the moderator here, but I know Bruce will. So, Bruce, what are you going to do? And also, if you could evaluate the officer's response here.
Well, I would assume there would be a violation for a battery because he did attempt to strike the officers. Safety being an issue, obviously one of our primary concerns is officer safety, community safety. But all that being said and done, I was very impressed with the fact that after this offender tried to punch one of the officers, that they didn't overreact. I mean, the reality of life is that we're going to deal with these offenders, unlike some police agencies who arrest them and never see them again. We're going to be dealing with this offender time and time again. And I think it speaks to our profession that they did not overreact to someone. When an offender strikes at us, that's a real big issue in an officer's life. And they could have probably overreacted like some agencies would have, and I was very impressed that they didn't. They responded with safe response, but didn't go beyond what was necessary to restrain or hold back this particular offender.
And I'm going to guess that was through good training and tactics.
Through good thinking, which probation officers, we have a tendency, we think well, and I think these officers did not react with emotion. They reacted with clear thinking, professional judgment.
And Bob, I'll turn to you as representing chiefs here. You'd be proud, I take it, of your officers responding this way?
I would, and I'm sure their chief was proud of the way they handled the situation. I was impressed, as Bruce was, with the fact that they didn't overreact. The first time that he got close, it was simple push in the chest. The second time, between the primary officer and the backup officer, they simply caught the arms. He was swinging, as he was, wildly, and they determined that they didn't need to do any more control other than stop it, separate him, push him back, and at that point he had winded himself. He had his hands on his knees. So they did a real good job. As far as filing a charge, I think that something needs to be filed in every situation where somebody attempts to strike an officer in the agency. obviously, because it is such a hazardous type profession and a hazardous incident, and follow the channels. There's a likelihood that nothing more would happen other than the fact that a charge would be filed, but at least it has to be pursued.
Right, and I'm sure we'd agree. Also, a note regarding the record and the file for future officers to look at the violence history. So, excellent points all around here. We're now going to sort of break and transition to a different approach to looking at hazardous incidents. We're going to look next at a critical incident, and this involves U.S. Probation Officer Chevelle Rudolph, who was involved in an incident earlier this year, a critical incident. And we thought, instead of trying to reenact this, that the most powerful and important message would be to hear Chevelle from her own words describing what happened. So let's all listen in. On February 12, 2003, Officer Chevelle Rudolph was on her way to an unscheduled home contact with a female offender who had been sentenced to return to a substance abuse treatment facility. Chevelle was wearing her vest and carrying pepper spray and a cell phone in her coat pocket. She saw a man in the building stairwell. He was unfamiliar to her and didn't seem to fit in to the building residents, mostly quiet senior citizens. The offender denied any knowledge of the man. After a 10-minute conversation, the offender was unlocking her apartment door when Chevelle realized that someone was simultaneously pushing his way through the door into the narrow interior hall.
He immediately pulls out a knife from his coat and places it to the offender's throat, grabbing her by her hair. I attempted to get around, but he blocked the doorway. She called him by name, and at that moment, it became apparent that she knew this individual. He forced me back into the apartment, again while he held her by her hair with the knife to her throat, inquiring if I was the police, repeatedly asking if I was the police, who was I. We both, myself and the offender, just identified myself as a friend who had stopped by to see her.
Continuing to express suspicion that she was with the police, the man ordered Chevelle to remove her coat and lift her shirt so that he could check for weapons. Dressed for cold weather, Chevelle was able to lift her vest along with other layers without the man noticing it. She assured him that she had no weapons and was not a police officer. The man ordered Chevelle into the bathroom, which meant that she would be separated from her coat and from her cell phone and pepper spray.
I hesitated, and that kind of agitated him, and he wielded the knife at me. And again, he repeated to go into the bathroom, and I took a step back, and he wielded the knife at me. Close enough to get my attention that, you know, if I don't comply, that it could be some form of assault on me. And I then had agreed, I said that I would go into the bathroom. I never gave my back to him. I went to the bathroom and he closed the door but left it slightly ajar. I could hear from inside the bathroom the offender screaming, calling him by name, that, you know, he was hurting her. Please don't hurt me.
Chevelle began plotting avenues of escape. The bathroom was cramped and the window was boarded. She knew the distance from the bathroom to the apartment door, but didn't know if the door was locked. The man suddenly opened the bathroom door, peeked in, and closed it again. She could hear the offender screaming and crying.
I did observe that there was a bottle of bleach on the floor. I was able to bend down and lift the bottle of bleach up just to make sure that it was actually bleach. If he had returned to the bathroom, I knew I needed to do something to divert the attention, because he had the knife, and the knife was his threat. And then at the same time, I wasn't sure if he had any additional weapons. Well, then afterwards, the door to the bathroom opens, but he doesn't come in, and he's apologizing from outside the bathroom. Miss, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And at that moment, I felt that was my time to then diffuse the situation, talking to him in a manner, listen, you don't have to apologize.
In response to Chevelle's offer of money, the man let Chevelle pick up her jacket and remove a $10 bill, which she handed him.
And then he asked if I had a cigarette, and I said, sure. and I extended a pack of cigarettes to him. He only took one out. He lit the cigarette, and his threat resumed on the offender. You know, I will hurt you. He advised her numerous times that if the police came after him, that he was going to come back to kill her. As he left the apartment, the offender becomes apologetic to me by calling me by my name, and I motioned her with my hand to my mouth not to say anything. I instructed her to go to the door, where she locked the door, put all 3 locks on the door. I then secured the door with the table and chair.
At this point, the offender admitted to Chevelle that her relationship with the assailant had involved previous physical assaults.
She told me that since 8:40 that morning, he had been trying to enter her apartment. The police had arrived about 9:40 that morning, took a complaint. A copy of the complaint was on the table. Again, she never told me about anything. So I paced and regained my composure, took the anxiety levels down. I made the calls to my supervisor and to my deputy, and I called the police, advised them what had taken place, and to come. Once the police had arrived, again, I identified myself as a federal officer. A complaint was taken, and I left with the police.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's an incredible story.
Mm.
A good story of survival, too.
Yes, yes.
How long was that entire incident from when you were forced in to when you left, do you think?
Maybe 15, 20 minutes.
What was going through your mind when the assailant blocked your exit, forcing you back inside the apartment?
Oh, what was he doing here? And when the knife came out, that this was not going to be a good day, that something was going to happen. What was going to happen, I did not know. It was the unknown that was not good. Mm-hmm.
Were you in fear for your life at that time?
Oh, of course I was in fear of my life.
Once he forced you into the bathroom and held you in there, what were your thoughts about what was happening and what you were going to do?
This was not the day. I was not going to die today. I was going to go home, and I was going to do what I needed to do to go home, or at least I was going to make an effort to do what I needed to do to go home.
So you immediately began to plan at that point?
Oh, I was planning all along. That's why I kept space between myself and him. I would not allow myself to be victimized that day. Mm-hmm.
And then subsequently, when he opens the door and begins to apologize to you, what were you thinking then?
The threat was still there. Why was he apologizing to me? Why was he there? Why does he want to hurt somebody? Why does he want to hurt her, the offender? And I'm just there, so now there's an extra body he has to deal with, and he can't have any witnesses to whatever it is that he came there to do. The thought kept running through my mind. Remain calm. Don't show any signs of nervousness. I kept eye contact on him the whole time. I kept space between us. I knew what was to my advantage. I knew the layout of the apartment, and by me keeping distance from him, he was not immediately on me. So if anything, we were going to just go around this apartment for a while until somebody got tired. But I just was not going to just give it to him that easy.
So you had a survival mindset
yes.
the whole time?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in regards to his demeanor and his conduct, during this incident, did you observe things about him that gave you clues to how to better manage him or manage the incident?
Well, again, when he entered the apartment, his eyes. I mean, looked at his eyes, and his eyes had a look of, I'm angry, I'm mad. His verbal tones, his voice, his body language, all was, I'm here to inflict harm, I'm here to hurt. And it came out just in the comments that he made to her, you know, using profanity towards her, telling her that he was going to hurt her. But then when he became apologetic, his look then had changed. His anxiety wasn't as high.
So what exactly did you say, or how do you remember, what do you remember about how you calmed him down and de-escalated this?
Talking to him in a manner of, I'm not angry with you. It's okay. I don't know why you're here. It's none of my business why you're here. But I did offer money to him. I didn't say how much. And he never asked how much would I be able to give, but I indicated that if he needed any money, that I did have some, and he was more than welcome to have it.
Chevelle, I'd like to kind of move things to sort of a different direction and have you reflect on some issues that relate to this incident. And the first thing, which we talked about earlier and I was interested in, is, I'm sure the officers watching are interested, is the criminal history that your assailant had, and what was that?
His history dates back to, I think back in the 60s. He was on, he had been on parole for bank robbery. He had violated his terms of parole. His arrest history was almost like 16 pages long. So he was considered a career offender.
And he had shot at a teller.
He had shot at a teller, and that he had shot at someone else. So he had charges for assault in the past.
One thing that some officers watching might be thinking about this whole incident is, if you had a partner with you, that might have prevented things from getting out of control. How do you respond to that?
I couldn't say if the partner would have made the situation better or if the partner would have made the situation worse. But I would say I know me, and I've been on this job for a number of years. For the most part, I tend to go in the field alone, and knowing that I do go in the field alone, I know I'm pretty much responsible just for myself.
As far as your ability to survive this incident, what would you describe that as, or what would you credit to surviving this incident?
It was a scary experience, but I didn't want to show that I was afraid. Remaining composed throughout the whole situation worked in my favor. Had I shrieked and screamed, that could have cost my life and hers as well. All the training that I received while on the job, it comes back. It's there in front of you, and you're not sitting there saying, okay, on page 9, paragraph 5, what did they tell me to do? It's all there, and everything that I've ever been taught as an officer here in terms of what you will go through, what you will experience when and if you're ever in this type of situation is real.
What message would you want to send to your officers, fellow officers around the country about facing and surviving a critical incident?
You have to use your training as your guide, and your common sense, your ability and your willingness to survive, and your willingness to, go through it, and you just keep going, determined that you're not going to give up. Be determined that you're going to get through it. Be determined that whatever it is that you have to do, you're going to go home.
Thank you for sharing such an important story of survival.
You're welcome.
Well, before you begin your discussions of that very, very powerful interview, I'd like to take a moment and personally thank Officer Chevelle Rudolph, who I know is watching with her district and her officers. That's a lot of courage to come forward, but also it's a lot of benefit to the field, not just for the hundreds watching today, but the hundreds who will be trained in the future through this program. So congratulations on your mindset and your safety, Officer Chevelle, and thank you very much. At this point, please take 5 minutes in your districts, reflect on what you've seen, and then we'll return here to the panel. Welcome back. I'm sure all of you had a good start to some discussion on this, and I'd like to extend that to the panel. And Bruce, I'd like to start with you. And I think what we heard a lot in that interview was safety mindset. How did you see that in her words as far as the incident and how she survived?
Well, obviously I was very impressed by her. I think she represents the many quality officers we have in the district and shows the value of some of the training that's taking place. Her mindset was incredible. Her self-message of survival, that was a key thing that came across to me, that she was going to survive the situation. There was no doubt in anyone's mind. The way that she was aware and her constant evaluation of what was going on from the moment she entered the situation, evaluating weapons that were available to her, possible escapes, clear mind, self-survival, self-message was just impressive. A very impressive officer.
So she was constantly adapting and always focused.
Absolutely.
Ron, from your situation, I know you do a lot of training in your district. How does an officer prepare for something like this? Is it training? Is it crisis rehearsal? What is it?
Well, I think it's several issues, Bill. I think the bottom line is it is training issues, mental, physical, tactical, your attitude. You need to have a plan, and you do that oftentimes through crisis rehearsal, playing the what-if game. If this happens, I'll do this. If that happens, I'll do that. You need to have an ongoing mental dialogue with yourself because in any encounter, dynamics change. You need to constantly assess and reassess the situation. You need to know your abilities, your strengths, and your weaknesses. I challenge us to take training seriously each and every time. Avoid complacency. Remember, nothing is routine. And I think probably most importantly is you need to adopt and internalize that will to win mindset that Bruce talked about, and only you can do that. Be committed to going home at the end of each day, no matter what. Just adopt that I will not lose mindset and mentality.
Good points made, Ron. And I'm sure if all of you remember from our first program, we talked about the personal commitment to safety as being the first thing an officer needs to focus on. So I think it's interesting we're coming back to that. Jeanette, your thoughts about what you saw?
Well, I was, impressed and blown away by this in the same respect because, these are real situations. They're not scenarios. We sometimes say scenarios, but they're real. And she was affected by this, and she's affected emotionally. You can tell by the way she's telling the story that this is with her like it happened yesterday. It's going to be with her in 10 years like it happened yesterday. And you look at that and you just think that, the value of the whole training process doesn't stop with just the training. We have to carry it through to after the event and what happens after a critical incident like that. I liked the way that she never stopped thinking and she was calming her emotions. She, instead of letting her emotions take over, she really was calming the whole time, but she continued to think. When he started apologizing, she didn't let her guard down. When the offender left, she didn't let her guard down. She locked the door, she regained her composure, started gathering more information. What else is here? What else can happen? I really, this is just an excellent example of what and how an officer should react. The other thing I just want to say, it keeps popping in my mind about that training. I keep hearing Brett Cole, our program safety and firearms administrator, saying, this is insurance when you get in training like this. This is your insurance. You don't know when it's going to happen, but if it does, that training is going to come back.
And she remarked on that. It did come back to her. And as you said, she was so focused and planning the entire time, post-incident also. Yeah. So, Isabel, your thoughts and reactions to what you saw?
Well, I'd like to commend Ms. Rudolph for her personal commitment to safety. That is so important, and just like everybody else has mentioned, the training, taking advantage of it, really learning when you take part in the training, because when you do run into situations like that, that's what's going to save you. You're going to revert to the way you were trained, and that's obviously what happened in this situation. So I'd like to really commend her and her district.
Yeah, I think it's an outstanding story and of survival and mindset. Bob, your thoughts about things?
I just wanted again to commend her for the job she did and congratulate her on coming home safely from this. A training issue that I saw from the interview was the fact that she had her cell phone and her capstun in the pockets of her jacket, which she got separated from. And is it an issue that you might want to keep in the back of your mind when you're getting ready to go to the field and you have your equipment, maybe not having it all in one place where you can get separated. I don't know that it would have made a difference in this case, but it's something that for the future that it may. And practice what you preach. Train, 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 train for what you hope never happens, but if it does, you know, you can end up coming out of it okay like she did.
So it's the what-if game and crisis rehearsal.
Always.
Gary, your thoughts, I know you do a lot of safety training. What are your thoughts about scenario training and how that helps you learn more about yourself and how you might react in such a situation?
I think we've used the term impressive about Ms. Rudolph on a number of occasions, excuse me, as panelists, and it's nothing short of that. If you've ever been involved in a traumatic or a critical incident, the ability to recall that information later on is basically how you went through it when it happened. And it's obvious through her conversation with the interviewer that during the entire process she thought through this. So recalling the situation for her wasn't difficult. If you've ever been traumatized before, there are gaps in time. Well, it doesn't appear to be any gaps in time for her. So that was impressive, knowing that when she went through this, she thought through the whole thing. Piggybacking on the comment Ron made about the what-if stories, the what-if scenarios, they're invaluable. You know, what if? There's no way to game plan or to role play every possible scenario. But if you get in the habit of thinking through situations, when you become involved in one, your first thought is, I'm thinking, I'm moving, because you've been through this in your mind already. So that self-talk and that crisis rehearsal is incredibly beneficial once you find yourself involved in that.
Outstanding points, Gary, and especially about mindset and survival. And I wish we had more time here to get into these issues. The benefit, though, goes to the districts now who have some extra materials, additional supplemental questions to go through and to consider regarding this issue. I do want to thank all of our panelists, especially on the phone, our remote panelists, and thank you, Ron, Gary, and thank you, Isabel, and also our in-studio panelists. Thank you, Bob, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Jeanette. And again, all of you, stay safe and study further. Robin.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to those of you who contributed to the program by sending us faxes. And thanks to all of you who took time out of your very busy schedules to watch the program and renew your personal commitments to safety. Safety facilitators, as a follow-up to this program, you can also register your districts for a web conference that we'll be holding on November 13. Advance registration is required. Please send us your evaluations. Along with the Safety Advisory Committee, you in the field are our very important partners in the development of this series. So please let us know how we can improve, let us know what you want to see, and we'll do our best to accommodate your requests. We'll be back in April with an all-new program, and we hope to see all of you again then. From all of us here at the FJC, thanks for watching.